Hello everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, we're going to be talking about the Meprolight RDS PRO V2 Optic, also known by its Israeli military designation of M5. As context for this video, I recently published a long-form presentation on M4 type firearms in Israeli military service. That project gave me an excuse to get some solid trigger time behind the M5. I found it to be a very intriguing and mostly compelling optic, and ultimately worthy of a dedicated review. With that in mind, today you can expect four things. First, brief historical and contemporary context for this optic. Second, overview of the optic's basic specifications and feature set. Third, a detailed analysis of the optic's strengths and weaknesses, particularly in comparison to well-known competitors. Fourth and finally, my personal assessment of whether or not this optic is worth buying and what types of consumers might want to consider it. As always, this video is broken up into chapters, so feel free to use those to skip around if you're just here for specific information. And as one final note before we begin, please be aware that this video has no sponsors and contains no affiliate links. As always, my only semi-ulterior motive is to earn channel growth and engagement by providing thoughtful analysis that you, the viewer, find useful. Speaking of which, if this video does prove useful to you, please consider hitting any combination of like, comment, and subscribe. That is what fuels this channel. Without further ado, let's dive in. First up, let's do some brief context on where this optic comes from. The Meprolight company was founded in Or Kiva, Israel in the 1990s for the purpose of supplying combat optics to the Israeli Defense Forces. Meprolight first found major success in the year 2000 when their battery-free M21 Reflex was formally adopted by the IDF. The M21 appears to have been heavily influenced by an earlier dual-illuminated reflex design from the US company Reticle. However, the American design struggled to find a market, whereas the Meprolight version was a commercial success. The M21 saw heavy use in and outside of Israel and remains in limited global service through the present day. Despite the M21's early success, the passage of time proved that dual-illuminated reflex optics offered more drawbacks than their battery-powered counterparts, and after about a decade with the M21, the IDF was ready for a more modern design. Meprolight once again stepped up to the plate and announced their new M5 model in September of 2011. This first generation of the M5 design was also released on the commercial market under the name TrueDot RDS. Although this model enjoyed decent sales and limited official use, it did not immediately secure a large-scale IDF contract. It wasn't until the second generation of M5 was released in 2015 that the IDF formally adopted the new Meprolight optic. This second generation of M5 replaced the TrueDot RDS in Meprolight's commercial catalog, now marketed under the model designation RDS PRO V2. Since 2016, the new Meprolight M5 has been the standard issue reflex sight for the majority of Israeli forces. It has not replaced the M21 entirely, but it has become the most common optic in IDF service. The M5 maintains this status in 2024, although it should be noted that they are facing increasing competition from American EOTechs and Swedish Aimpoints, both of whom are aggressively competing for future IDF contracts. Regardless of how that shakes out, however, nothing will change the fact there are a lot of M5s in IDF inventory currently, and that means they will continue to see frontline service for many years, if not decades to come. So that's the context. Now let's talk about the basic specifications and feature set of the M5. And one more time for clarity, we are specifically talking about the second generation of M5 here, also known as the RDS PRO V2. It is my understanding that the first generation TrueDot RDS is an extremely similar optic. However, that's not the generation I tested and researched, so bear that in mind. Either way, this is a military-grade reflex sight manufactured by an ISO 9001 certified entity in compliance with relevant international military standards, including US Mil Standard 810 Golf. The optic is 4.6 inches in length, 2.4 inches in width, and 2.7 inches in height. It weighs about 10.1 ounces without a battery and 10.7 ounces with a single AA battery installed. The optic body is made of coated aluminum with a protruding lens shroud made from high-impact polymer. Speaking of that lens shroud, one of the more distinctive features of the M5 is its exceptionally large display window, which measures 1.3 inches by 0.8 of an inch in size. Of additional note is the fact that this display window uses crystal clear front and rear lenses with no visible tint or coating. It should be noted that Meprolight advertises these lenses as being non-externally reflective. However, we will revisit that claim in the next section. In terms of its mounting interface, the M5 has a QD Picatinny mount integrated into the optic body. That mount includes 2 tension-adjustable weapon adapter levers and 1 fixed recoil lug. This factory mounted configuration centers the display window approximately 1.6 inches above the rail, right in the middle of the accepted range for a lower third co-witness. The most common reticle for the M5 is a 2 MOA dot surrounded by a 55 MOA ring with vertical and horizontal reference slashes. This reticle is available to commercial customers in red or green. The reticle is adjusted using exposed windage and elevation dials, which move the point of impact 1/2 MOA per click. Finally, the reticle brightness is controlled by this dual function mode selector. By rotating the wheel, the user can quickly select one of 5 gross brightness adjustments. Position 0 is the off position, positions 1 through 3 offer descending levels of visible brightness, and position 4 is a dedicated night vision setting. Within positions 1 through 4, the mode selector wheel can also be clicked inward to cycle through 4 additional brightness settings, giving a total of 12 visible brightness settings and 4 night vision settings. Finally, the M5 utilizes automatic shutoff and shake awake, meaning that after 2 hours of inactivity, the Optic will power down to conserve battery, but will instantly power back up if any movement is detected. Speaking of battery conservation, the estimated battery life on these is around 3,000 hours. So pretty bad compared to something like an Aimpoint, but roughly double what you can expect from most EOTech models. In summary, although the Meprolight M5 is a traditional red dot or reflex optic by design, the footprint and feature set that it offers would be best compared to Western holographic sights. In fact, if you've ever used an EOTech 553, US Army designation SU-231, I think you will find the M5 to be extremely familiar. That said, the M5 does have entirely distinct performance characteristics of its own, so let's get into those now. I'm going to break down M5 performance into pros and cons, and we'll start with the pros. First up, let's circle back to this being a military-grade reflex sight. Some people will laugh that off as marketing, but I don't, and I'll tell you why. There are tons of platitudes floating around regarding what mil-spec does and does not mean, but the simple truth in this case is that in manufacturing this specific product, Meprolight adhered to industry-leading durability standards and quality control procedures. Furthermore, the M5 has passed large-scale military trials, proven itself in combat, and was adopted for general issue by a country that owns F-35s. Obviously, individual consumers are free to place as much or as little value on that as they want, but I would discourage dismissing it altogether. Many optics have good reputations, but this optic has an actual resume. Second, the M5 is powered by a single AA battery. Opinions will vary on how valuable this really is, but I'm firmly on Team AA. If I learned one thing from the military, it's that there's no such thing as too much redundancy, so it makes sense to me for weapon enablers to accept the most common alkaline battery on the planet. You can use lithium AA's if you have them, and you can pop open a TV remote or children's toy if you don't. More options are always better than fewer. Third, I like the factory mount height for the M5. As I mentioned earlier, the vertical center of the display window sits approximately 1.6 inches from the top of the upper receiver. That means that our aiming point is slightly elevated compared to the height of standard iron sights. However, it's not so high that we can't still use our backup irons through the optical window. We just need to shift our eyes down to the lower third of the lens. Of course, there are strengths and weaknesses to every optical height, and therefore lower third isn't ideal for every application, but I do think it's the best overall compromise. In other words, as long as Meprolight was going to integrate a non-adjustable mount height for general military issue, which is what they did, I think they picked the correct height. So that's another tick in the pro column. Fourth, one very unique feature of this optic that I mentioned earlier is that it uses gigantic crystal clear lenses. And when I say gigantic, I mean gigantic. We are talking 33% greater surface area than an average EOTech. The reason this is a pro for me is because the M5 display window has the best passive light transmission I have ever seen in an optic. And although light transmission doesn't matter much during the day, it is a big deal under nods. Now, unfortunately, we are going to revisit night vision performance again once we get to cons, but for now, I will say that under some lighting conditions, the Meprolight M5 is the most impressive low-light optic I have ever used. I'm sure I'm rolling some footage now so you can see what I'm talking about, but there is literally no better recipe for light transmission than huge, uncoated lenses. This absolutely blows aimpoint light transmission out of the water, and it's significantly better than EOTech, which I consider to be the gold standard for NV performance. And not only is the M5 pumping at least a third more light through the display, but the housing is lower profile, reducing housing shadow and creating a remarkably clean analog sight picture. Moving on, the fifth property that impressed me about the M5 is how it handles internal reflection. This was one of my main concerns for the optic because, long story short, there are a lot of great reasons why reflex sights typically use lens coatings, and one of those reasons is to mitigate internal reflection. In case anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about here, internal reflection is the phenomenon in which at certain angles, arcs of reflected light can appear inside an optical window, sometimes in such a way that distracts from the reticle itself. On paper, I was concerned that the M5's crystal clear lenses might lend themselves to significant internal reflection. And as a matter of fact, they do. The thing is, the shape of the emitter lens consistently organizes that light into a faint symmetrical halo, which actually complements the bullseye reticle nicely, not unlike the ACSS Vulcan reticle. In other words, rather than distract from the reticle, the M5's internal reflection actually creates greater visual reference for the aiming point itself. And whether intentional or not, this actually helps mitigate yet another potential problem with this lens design, which is parallax deviation. Keep in mind that parallax is always a potential problem in reflex sights with large display windows for the simple reason that they allow you to see the reticle from angles at which it would not be visible in smaller sights. If you were to use the reticle as an aiming point from such an extreme angle, you may experience a parallax shift between your point of aim and point of impact. This is why consistent head position is always a critical marksmanship skill, even when using single aiming point optics. So not only is the M5's internal reflection not a problem, it's actually kind of a solution, as it creates an intuitive frame of reference for the shooter to center the reticle in the display window. Once again, I have no idea if that was clever engineering or just a happy accident, but it's definitely a pro for the Optic. Sixth pro, and a quick one here, the windage and elevation adjustments are extremely positive. Not only is this convenient for making adjustments, but it also gives me the impression of particularly robust internals. One of the most concerning failures I have personally experienced in commercial grade reflex optics is shearing or freezing of the reticle adjustment mechanism. Consequently, I've developed something of a paranoia that this mechanism may be an underappreciated failure point on a host of otherwise popular commercial models. Many consumers only zero their optic once, creating the possibility for a legitimate design flaw to go unnoticed by the vast majority of consumers. Given my lack of trust in that regard, I really like that the M5's adjustments feel overbuilt, and when we consider their military track record, I feel confident that reticle adjustment is not going to be a failure point on this model. Seventh and finally, the last positive thing I'll say for the M5 is that like all Meprolight products I've tested, I really like their packaging and branding. Obviously, this isn't super important. At the end of the day, a product needs to speak for itself. That said, I do absolutely appreciate when companies make an effort to give their customers a well-rounded experience. Meprolight branding is neat as a pin, their packaging is clever and secure, and they always include a couple of useful accessories. In the case of the M5, you get an elastic field cover and a cleaning kit. None of these would make up for a bad optic, but given that this is a good optic, those extra flourishes certainly do not hurt. And that's pretty much it for pros, but obviously we checked a lot of important boxes there. We still need to talk about cons, however, and I do have 3 to address, so we'll start with the least concerning here and escalate from there. First up, I already mentioned that Meprolight advertises the M5 as having no external reflection due to the lack of a lens coating. As such, they do not market a kill flash or anti-reflection device for this optic, nor have they engineered any provisions to mount one into the design. I did a little testing on my own, and I'm not sure I agree with their claim. It does appear to me that the M5 exhibits less external reflection than an Aimpoint or an EOTech, but it's still reflecting a concentrated beam of light, which could betray a shooter's position under the wrong circumstances. In any case, ARDs are usually a good idea, and it's not at all clear to me that this optic wouldn't benefit from one. Second con, although I really like the natural height of this integrated Picatinny mount, I think the interface itself is inefficiently engineered, at least when used on an AR platform. The issue is that this optic takes up way more rail space than it has to, forcing the end user to make choices that I don't think they should have to make. Even if you mount this optic in the forwardmost position of a standard AR upper, it occupies a staggering 9 of the 13 available Picatinny slots. That means that people who use an M5 on an AR can have a backup iron sight, or they can have a magnifier, but they cannot have both. And just to illustrate exactly how inefficient that is, let's compare the M5 to this EOTech 558. Despite the fact that the EOTech is a significantly longer optic, it still only takes up 5 Picatinny slots on the upper receiver, leaving plenty of space for both a rear sight and a magnifier, should that be your preference. Now, in Meprolight's defense, it should be noted that the M5 was not specifically designed around the AR-15, but rather was designed to be used on both the AR-15 as well as the Tavor series of rifles. And when we take a look at the monolithic rail layout of the popular X95 Micro, we see that the M5 would actually use that space more efficiently than the previous EOTech 558. Unfortunately, it's not 2015 anymore, and most of Meprolight's foreign and domestic customers are using ARs, not Tavors, so this design hasn't aged as gracefully as it could have. So now to my third, final, and most serious complaint, reticle brightness. Unlike the earlier M21, the Meprolight M5 offers 16 user-adjustable brightness settings, which on paper sounds like plenty. That's exactly how many you get from an Aimpoint CCO, for example. The problem is Aimpoint simply picked the wrong settings. It's a very small and presumably easily avoided error, and yet it single-handedly prevents this optic from living up to its full potential. Here's the problem. Let's visualize reticle brightness as a spectrum, kind of like this. At the very bottom, we have imperceptibly dim, a brightness level which would only be appropriate while using high-performance analog night vision in near pitch darkness. At the very top, we have extremely bright, a brightness level which would only be appropriate while wearing dark sunglasses in intense sunlight on a white sand beach. And because this is a spectrum, of course, we have everything in between. Most optics allow you to navigate this full spectrum, with each adjustment increasing or decreasing the brightness by even intervals. Some optics get a little fancier by including a little bit of dead space between night vision and daylight settings, or by altering the adjustment levels between night vision specific settings. The Meprolight M5 takes yet a different approach. As I've previously described, the M5 offers 4 gross brightness settings, each of which can be cycled through 4 fine adjustments. If we were to visualize that on our spectrum, it would look a bit like this. And when we look at it this way, the problem is pretty obvious. Incredibly fine adjustments are great, but not when they come at the cost of creating significant dead space in that overall spectrum. The M5 may have 16 technically distinct brightness settings, but in practice, it really feels like just 4. The difference between the brightest and dimmest subsettings within a given range is essentially insignificant. In fact, under many lighting conditions, it's not even perceptible to the naked eye. Hopefully I'm showing you a clip of that now. By contrast, the optic's inability to accommodate certain portions of the spectrum has real consequences, particularly under night vision. Despite ostensibly having 4 night vision settings, the M5's adjustments are so fine that it essentially functions as a single setting. Unsurprisingly, that single setting only functions well under specific lighting conditions and struggles with others. Under extremely low light conditions, the dimmest M5 setting is far too bright. It's still usable as an aiming point, but the excess light completely washes out the display window, creating a photonic barrier which totally negates the otherwise best-in-class light transmission. Here we can see the dimmest setting of the M5 compared to the dimmest setting on an Aimpoint and an EOTech, and you can see that the Meprolight is much brighter. On the other side of the coin, if we observe the same optics under infrared floodlighting, relatively bright for night vision utilization, we now find that the M5's brightest night vision setting is just a bit too dim. Once again, the dimmest and brightest night vision settings on the M5 are essentially the same brightness. By contrast, the Aimpoint and EOTech are able to scale up and match these conditions perfectly. At least now we can appreciate the M5's light transmission again, but it's still not working as well as it should be. With all that in mind, it's really only under specific mixed lighting conditions that the M5's night vision brightness is perfect. The M5 now transforms into a totally different animal, outperforming even the vaunted EOTech. Ironically, however, even under these perfect conditions, cycling through the 4 subsettings of the night vision mode doesn't seem to make a big difference one way or another. So that's my biggest complaint with the M5. I'm not sure if this is the product of overthinking or underthinking, but Meprolight made a mistake here, plain and simple. They made 16 brightness settings feel like 4 brightness settings, and they turned what could have been the best passive aiming optic on the planet into something less memorable. Obviously, there are a lot of customers that don't use night vision, and this might not be as big of a deal to them, but for those that do, it's an extremely frustrating, unforced error. So in summary, the Meprolight M5 is overall a very good optic with a lot going for it, but a few annoyingly simple design flaws prevent it from being exceptional. I do think that overall it represents serious competition to the most established military-grade reflex sights of the era. It even beats them in some categories. However, based on its inefficient footprint and bizarrely constricted brightness settings, I do think it ultimately falls just short of the industry staples. And with that, we segue into the final portion of the video in which we will assess value. So the question is, given what we know about the strengths and weaknesses of the M5, does it represent a good value for consumers? Short answer, yes, I think it does. The thing is, the Meprolight RDS PRO V2 is a sub $500 optic. List prices tend to be in the $480 to $490 range, but sale prices in the low 400s are not hard to find. My example was purchased during a major retailer's Labor Day sale, and I paid $430. Obviously, that's nothing to sneeze at. We're talking premium optic prices here, but throughout this video, I've been comparing the M5 to high-end Aimpoints and EOTechs that retail in the $750 to $1,000 range. From a commercial market perspective, the RDS PRO V2 is more directly competing with entry-level offerings from those companies, such as the Aimpoint Pro or the EOTech 512. And both of those are rock-solid optics, by the way, but they have real deficiencies of their own. For example, the Aimpoint Pro uses an obscure battery and has mediocre light transmission, and the EOTech 512 doesn't include night vision brightness settings at all. Of course, there are other popular optics to consider at this price point, including the Triticon MRO, the Holosun AMS, the Vortex UH1, and SIG's 4XT Pro and Romeo 8, just to name a few. But the point again is that none of these optics are without their own drawbacks. There is no such thing as a perfect optic for $500, only very good ones. Choosing between them will ultimately come down to which properties an end user prioritizes. What's right for me isn't always right for you, or vice versa. All that said, I will speak for myself in saying that I have been extremely impressed with this optic for the price point, and unlike many products I review on this channel, I plan to keep this for myself rather than resell it. For the past few months, I've been building out and testing an MP5 setup, and long story short, I've absolutely fallen in love with it. It recently hit the 2,000 round mark, and I decided it had earned an upgrade from the place-holding Holosun optic it was using. And after getting some inspiration from this pretty cool photograph, I realized that the Meprolight might be just the ticket. And sure enough, it's a great pairing. The M5 is a rock-solid optic I would trust with my life. It takes my preferred battery type. The reticle is great for close and far holds with 9mm projectiles, and it holds its own under nods. Sure, there are better optics out there, but I can't think of a better optic for this application that I could get without spending several hundred additional dollars. And just as one last point of reference, I actually sold an Aimpoint Pro in order to buy this optic, and while I have absolutely nothing bad to say about Aimpoint Pros, I recommend them to people all the time, I do think that for my application, the Meprolight does bring more to the table. And that's it for today, guys. As always, I hope this video was useful, entertaining, or at least worth the time you spent watching it. If I did earn your engagement today, please don't forget to hit any combination of like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the channel. Other than that, thanks again for taking the time to check out this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.